So I'm a social psychologist based at the Woolf Institute in the other place, and I'm leading a project that's using the technology that Justin and colleagues have developed to try and understand the moral concerns and psychological concerns that drive both conflict and cooperation in 3 different post-conflict societies. Northern Ireland, a place that is very close to my heart, Bosnia, and South Sudan. But the team is interdisciplinary. We have Justin, who did his DPhil here in cognitive anthropology. We have a data scientist, an archaeologist, a social psychologist, and of course, the token philosopher. Everyone needs a philosopher. And what brings us all together is our passion for using this incredible multi-agent AI technology to really understand and address huge societal challenges, so breakdowns in social cohesion. What are the moral factors that seem to drive cooperation and/or conflict in areas that are particularly vulnerable? And the work that we've done spans not just war, not just conflict. We've also worked in various different parts of the world, so with the Dutch government, for example, looking at the integration of Syrian refugees. We have worked with the Norwegian government, looking at COVID-19 misinformation, and most recently we're working with the UNDP offices in Palestine and Bosnia, building on the work that our project has done. So as I said, I lead this project, Forgiveness and Future Building, and the main aim of this really was to use this technology to pull out moral concerns that appear to be driving conflict or moves towards conflict in these post-conflict locations, but also what are the factors that underlie moves towards cooperation. And as I said, AI, everybody's an AI expert, but the AI technology that we use is slightly different. It's called multi-agent AI technology. So traditionally, you might think of things like machine learning when you think of AI, training the system to do something very fast or categorizing something very fast. Our approach is slightly different in the sense that we create digital societies, digital twins, that are populated by psychologically realistic agents. So these are agents that have been programmed by algorithms that are based in empirical work on evolved human cognition. And so what this allows us to do is to simulate these societies, and stakeholders can see the conditions under which and the mechanisms by which social variables interact and evolve. And at this point, I'm going to hand you over to Justin.
When we approached this project, we knew that we were going to need a lot of data in order to try and get a nice bird's eye view, particularly if we're going to be doing comparisons and contrasts between 3 different areas. So we went and we utilized web scrapers. We have access to social media data. The company currently works with both Twitter and Reddit, for example. And also you have the ability to scrape news articles pretty much anywhere in the world where you can back your system into things like Google News. So that's exactly what we did. We backed our system into Google News, and we used this to scrape down about 52 million articles from all over the globe that were specifically focused on the news about these 3 locations. We did end up putting Ukraine also into the analysis, since that happened. The invasion happened, I think, about a month before the funding cleared from the donor. But we're not going to be presenting that here. We're working in that in other spaces. The news stream analytics goes back about 50 years. We were able to use things like the GDELT database to get a lot of the older data as well. And the way we analyze the news is very similar to, you may be familiar with sentiment analysis, where you can put something in your social media data or a text of some kind, and it can tell you if it's positive or negative. Our system is a lot like that on steroids. We have positive and negative sentiment, but we also have over 90 additional categories that go into things like morality and psychology, ethnicity, racial concerns, whether or not things are related to hate speech, whether or not they're related to sort of fundamental threats like contagion, social threats, natural environment threats, these sorts of issues. The data stream can currently span over 140 countries, so we're only going to talk about 3, but as Kitty mentioned, we have expanded this to focus on places like Palestine. We're also looking in a lot of the places in the Sahel as well with the partners that we're currently having discussions with. So it's something that we built deliberately to be flexible. One of the reasons for this is because we know that working with policymakers, they don't have 18 months for us to write a grant, do research, and then give them an answer. If a prime minister calls you at 11 p.m. one night, you have about 18 hours to give them something useful before their team is going to make a decision and go public. So our idea is say, let's use research that typically would be done over a 2-year period or an 18-month period and be able to give those results to people in 18 hours instead. And so we've automated all of this data pipeline using all sorts of fancy things that even I don't fully understand. But the ultimate sort of output of this is a way of leveraging these digital twin simulations that Kitty mentioned, right? So the idea being almost, in analogy, people will say Black Mirror if you're a Netflix fan these days, more classically The Matrix. You have the ability to have a population in a digital or synthetic space where they're psychologically realistic, they can interact in real social networks that are drawn from the real world, and you can utilize this to test new policies, to test how messages will work, and really get a good sense for how these things are going to, how a society will act and interact in response to some sort of push or pull. You can do this, and then you can run this simulation 100,000 times to understand the average output, right? In any complex system, you have randomness, you have stochasticity, you have the unpredictability that many of the people who are more on the qualitative side of conflict know all too well. And just the being in the conflict, studying the conflict, spending 10, 20 years dedicating a life to understanding that conflict can give you that. A computer can't do that in the same way. A mathematical model can't do that in the same way. It can maybe bootstrap knowledge for policy and sort of your wonk analysts. But in order to try and better understand, what the extremes might be, we are utilizing supercomputers to run these simulations 100,000 times. So it's not just sort of a policy in, we ran it once, and we assume that's going to be the end-all and be-all. You really need to understand the complexities of it. And in this sense, what we end up having is a policy sandbox where you can kind of test different things. In particular, for this project, the idea has been, what are the pushes and pulls of conflict? If you see things in the media, if you see politicians saying certain things, is this going to have a positive or negative effect on things like cooperation and conflict? This, of course, is a very low-risk testing environment, which is very nice, even nicer than a focus group, because you can do this with millions of agents as opposed to just 30 or 40. One of the potential outputs that we had, and for some people here, they're going to wonder why we did it this way. This is basically a network that shows the correlations between variables in our system, specifically focused on the moral foundations in Northern Ireland. One of the things that Kitty particularly was very interested in looking at were issues of revenge and forgiveness. What we found is that revenge and forgiveness has precious little to do with anything in a conflict, actually. Revenge is moving some things. When it comes to the number of events that we're getting, conflict events in Northern Ireland over the last 10 years, you are seeing them connected with revenge. You're also seeing them related to morality. Particularly one of the things that pops up specifically, it is correlated with the amount of news discussing things like fairness. So if you're familiar with Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory, these are the moral foundations that are built into our AI system as well. So we're trying to create congruence between the information you can get in the literature, particularly things you could deploy in a survey if you needed survey data to be compatible, and then also the artificial intelligence that can do it at scale. We decided not to go with traditional correlations here because when we were talking with policymakers, we kept getting this feedback. They wanted something more visual. They wanted something that kind of shows that richness. And we were able to work actually with a product designer who decided that this network approach is actually going to work really well. So something that I won't go too far down the rabbit hole with that I think all of us should always think about is, how do people use what it is we put out into the open? How do the policymakers use this? And how can we make it as frictionless as possible? In a way almost, can we design this like Steve Jobs designed an iPhone so that everyone can use this clearly and quickly and they can understand as much of the nuance and subtlety as we do as quickly as possible since they're the ones that we hand off to make the decisions. Now, when it comes to the digital twins, one of the keys to this is parameterizing the model. You don't want to just start from a blank slate. You want to give it something that looks more or less like the country that you're trying to model. So if we're going into Bosnia, we want a digital twin that looks like Bosnia. It has the population of Bosnia. It has general personality distributions similar to the data in Bosnia. And then look at that in terms of how the input data goes. The output data being things like conflict patterns and changes in those networks and the intergroup relations over time, we can validate that as well, looking at things like conflict records, conflict reports, any data that the stakeholders that we work with might have in terms of surveys or in terms of sort of government reports that may or may not be as publicly available. This then goes into a system. So this is one of several subsystems that are actually in the model. I figured I would show this one because I know a lot of people here are very familiar with the work of Sacred Values because of Scott's influence in the group and how useful it is in this area. This is a sort of flowchart diagram of how information gets incorporated from personal experiences like intense emotional experiences or very frequent sort of boring low arousal experiences, riding the bus to work every day. And how aspects like cognitive mechanisms such as reflection can create this sort of central pool of information where as we reflect on an intense experience, it becomes very central to how we see ourselves as a person. It becomes internalized in our own personal identity. And how this can actually have an interaction with the frequent low arousal experiences that build up our social schemas, that define more of a collective culture and a collective consensus. And what we find is that as these two different information schemas between sort of personal and social start to blend and you start to get the ties and the links in the agents between these emotionally charged events and these socially shared totemic ideas that define the group, you really start to get this idea of being willing to fight and die for your group, your inability to dissociate yourself from your group, and that oneness that identity fusion really talks about. And in this sense, we found that we do start to get this hydraulic relationship between this more extreme approach to identity fusion or to social identification and the more traditional social identity approach where you can kind of back yourself off from your social group under an attack if that's what's needed to maintain that sort of positive self-image. Now, these we find actually have different effects on consensus. So fusion, this idea of reflection kind of inserts idiosyncratic beliefs into the idea. So somebody mentioned Whitehouse. So of course, this is something that's very inspired by his work. When I had started some of this, I was actually one of his DPhil students. So this may sound very familiar from that. One of the things that we find though is that social identification does have a positive effect on within group consensus. But when you iterate this one architecture in an agent-based population, in one of these digital twin simulations, and you put millions of agents and allow them to interact in different ways, you start to see that you can get schisms that open up in society. And you can actually predict where these fissures come and where those lines become sort of the most drawn in a way. So these are your cultural lines in the sand. And this becomes a very interesting aspect of the simulation to focus on, particularly if you're looking at conflict, but because those are the lines in a way that people aren't crossing, sort of except to fire back and forth at one another in a different and complex cultural environment. This graph here gives us sort of the bird's eye view. When we run, in this case we ran about 170,000 simulations of the conflict in Northern Ireland, and we were trying to better understand how does this model behave, so something they call model validation. And what we basically found is that the key aspects that are really predicting how much conflict there would be one way or another. So if we take away the constraints of history and we say, don't just learn the data pattern of the monthly attacks in Northern Ireland. We have a system that we know can do that with 98% accuracy is what we found. The idea then became, take off the gloves there. Take a lot of the different variables and vary them and really understand the complex space of conflict, not any one particular conflict, and then see what is it about this conflict architecture that can predict Northern Irish patterns, also Gujarat, India, with a reasonable amount of accuracy that says that this is an interesting model to study. What's pushing and pulling conflict the most? And what we found actually is that the number of values sort of being discussed about in that cultural environment is very critical, and that it's either if it's very high or very low. So you have this distribution that goes into both different directions, right? You don't just have one answer. You have two different answers here to optimize for. And the other one is what we called cultural dissonance. And I think this actually plays very well with some of the earlier presentations, because that is really trying to capture how different the idea is between two groups, right? So everyone may have an idea of what justice means, but the way that one group might use it and another group uses it are extremely different, right? And this is true whether or not this is just a value being spoken about or if it's a value that has become a sacred value in a majority of the agents. Other aspects, things like memory, how much information there is in the system, how much information is flowing in the way that the agents are interacting at any given time step. Those also do have effects, but we really see that this aspect of how beliefs are formed and interacted with end up being the biggest push and pull. And this really drove us down the idea of saying we need to interact more with things like social media data and news stream data so that these are not just ones and zeros, but there's actually a semantic awareness of the agents so that you have these almost one-to-one belief snapshots of different communities that you can experiment on. So the next steps that we have here, naturally we're liaising regularly with different stakeholders on the ground in Northern Ireland, the Balkans, and to an extent South Sudan, particularly through work with the Foreign Office here. In Northern Ireland, we're looking to continue this work and set up a nice network of research that I think can really facilitate this going forward. Naturally in Bosnia, we're going to be working with the UNDP. The GDELT language, or the GDELT news stream itself that we relied a lot on to gather this data, we found out has a number of different biases, including an English language bias, that we've started to supplement by adding local news sources in. So I live in Slovakia, for example, and I can tell you that the English language newspaper is read by like half of the expats in Bratislava. Definitely not the #1 news source in the country, but these are the sorts of things that GDELT and the Google system is trying to assume. Also, fun fact, Google in the GDELT system does not know that Slovakia exists. They are not aware of the Velvet Revolution and all of the things that came in the subsequent years. So instead you have to select Czechoslovakia and then exclude the Czech Republic, and that's how you get Slovakia. They were thrilled when I told them that back home in Bratislava. The next aspect is the updates that we're doing are also able to handle pidgin languages. So social media, of course, where you have Spanish and English, or pretty much any post-colonial state where you have a number of different languages being spoken. This will not really be language specific. It will be able to take in pidgin languages without any problem there. Integrating survey research, and also audio streams. So we are currently working with a lot of these as well. The 3 countries that we have now that we kind of can show and discuss in public being the ones that we've mentioned here, and then naturally also discussing this with a number of different sort of stakeholders with the UN to try and see what we can do. Definitely a big thanks for us with Culture Pulse and the Wolf Institute. We also have the DEC Institute and Rethinking Conflict have been really, really giving partners here. We've loved working with those guys. So that's pretty much it. Thank you.